Hello and welcome to episode 2 of The Economy Ruins Everything. My name is Walter, I'm your host today, and this episode is about GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. That is the second of 3 major structures of our economy. Now, when I entered in to a search, what is GDP? Here's what it comes up with. Gross domestic product is the total monetary value or market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. All right, GDP is measured quarterly and annually. Now, the Federal Reserve has a nice graph of GDP. Now this graph goes from the first quarter of 1947 all the way through to the last quarter of 2025. And you can see here, starting in 1947, at nearly 0 on the scale register on the side, and this scale is registered in the billions of dollars. It says right here, billions of dollars. 0, 4,000, 8,000, 12,000, 16,000, going up in increments of 4,000. Now, along the bottom of the scale, the register is in years, in 5-year increments. 1950, 1955, 1960, 1965, etc., all the way up to 2025. And as you can see from this chart, the growth line starts out very shallow and gradually climbs, and the climb gets steeper and steeper. This is an exponential growth line, going up eventually to vertical. Now, just as a note of observation, nothing grows infinitely. There's nothing in our universe that grows infinitely. And by our universe, I mean Earth, the solar system, the galaxy. Now, perhaps the universe itself might grow infinitely, but I don't think we know that for sure. Currently, as of the last quarter of 2025, which ended midnight December 31st, 2025, our GDP in the United States of America was $31 trillion, plus some change. Specifically, 31 trillion 856 billion 257 million. All right, so that's a pretty substantial number. $31.8 trillion. Now, let's look at it in 3 dimensions. As I did in the first video about debt, I'm going to use Legos to demonstrate in physical form our GDP. Now this is a Lego brick, a single space wide and 4 spaces long. Its height is 0.378 of an inch. And this little construct here is a sample of what I'm going to use to measure GDP. The layers, each independent layer, blue to green, blue to green, blue to green, is going to represent $1 trillion. Now, these are Legos, and I do not have enough Legos to demonstrate GDP across the entire history, but I do have enough to demonstrate the final couple of years, and we'll see those in a little while. Meanwhile, we're going to use the same dimensions of height and width of these Legos to create blocks in a three-dimensional program so we can look at GDP all at once. So, let's bring up GDP. And we're going from 1952 onward, and the size of these blocks, looking at them from the top down, are the same size as those Lego layers of blocks that I showed you earlier. All right, these ones don't quite have the height of the Lego blocks because they haven't reached $1 trillion yet. So let's move down the line. There we go. And find the first, here it is. In 1969, that was the first time, that red block right there is a complete $1 trillion block. And each block after it is 1 trillion and then some. So the economy, measured as GDP, exceeded $1 trillion in 1969. You can see the dark green, just barely visible cap on that light green right there. All right, so that's a fraction of a trillion over the first trillion. Okay, so this is the way the graph reads. This is familiar from the Federal Reserve graph that I showed you on the website a little while ago. And this is what it looks like viewed from the side. All right, now this is how we would normally read a graph. All right, now there's, as I found, a bit of a problem with this. And so I'm going to give you now your first look at why our cost of living has gotten so epically out of control. All media and all politicians will tout, they will expand magnificently upon how much GDP grows. Let's focus in on the last years that we have here. All right, this is $31 trillion and change. Okay, and this is $29 trillion and change. So the economy grew in 1 year by $1.7 trillion. And that makes the news. That is what our leadership talks about all the time. We hear this in all news reports about the economy, is how much GDP has grown, how much the economy has grown. Let's flip back to in reality. There's our baseline. There's the count of years. And I'm going to bring debt back in again. And we're going to start out. There's 1952, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 1960, 1961, the year I was born. Now let's bring in GDP. The thing is, GDP can't be measured from this baseline. GDP has to be measured from the bottom of wherever the debt pit is. And so here we go. All right, now I'm going to bring in a closer look at this. Let's look at 1952 specifically. And what do you see here? here's our GDP for the year. And here's our debt for the year of 1952. Now look at 1953. Here's our GDP. And here's our debt. 1954. There's the GDP. It's grown marginally, but the debt is larger. Now, oops. I'm going to back off a bit, and then I'm going to pull us along in the years. And you can see that debt is quite a lot more in every year than GDP is. Now, I'm going to highlight this part right here so that I can rotate the view around it. Because what I want to show you is that GDP has to start at the bottom of the pit created by the debt. Okay? Because that is where we're at. We're in a pit. Now I'm going to switch back to an upper view of this. Deselect that. Look at that. Our GDP may have grown, but the debt is so much larger than the GDP. Now, when you look at this graph, this is accurate. This is accurate because GDP starts at the bottom of whatever hole that debt requires it be. It cannot stand at this line and go up. That's misleading. This is our real situation. Now, this is how the graphs read if they're kept in the upright position with a starting point over here in the bottom left corner and the end point at the bottom right corner, and all readings going up the scale. All right, now we can very clearly see that debt is greater than GDP. We can see how that's problematic. All right, but this doesn't hit you in the same way as the previous image does, because this is not truthful. And I'm going to show you something else here. All right, we're going to go over here to the earlier years, and you can see how these blocks are very small. Okay, very small. It's very hard to see the difference between these sets of blocks. So, in the earlier, or in this image, we're looking at blocks like this, made of Legos. We're going to change the scale. This is a 1 inch by 1 inch cube. All right. This is a level playing field with a grid that's 10 years long, starting in 1952 and ending in 1959. We're going to look at things using the scale of a cube instead of the Lego bricks. And the reason for that is by changing the scale to where a cube equals $1 trillion, it's a lot easier to see the differences. So let's bring in GDP. There we go. Now this is how much, this field is called gains, GDP gains. So this is not the entire GDP. This is just how much GDP grew in a single year since the previous year. And you can see here in from 1952, we have a null reading here. That's the level we start at. So this represents the growth in 1 year of GDP in 1953. This represents the growth of GDP over 1953's final total. This represents 1955's total growth over 1954's total. All right, so this is just the growth. All right. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is the new debt for the year taken on during the same years. Now, look at that. The new debt taken on to grow the economy this much was much larger than the economic growth. Same for 1954. 1955 looks really close. Maybe GDP is greater that year, but nope, look at that. New debt is still greater than GDP growth. All right. Same for 1956. Definitely the same for 1957. In 1958 and 1959, it's clearly visible that more debt was taken on than the economy new growth. All right, so when the subject of economic growth is brought up, you will find that the politicians and the economists are eager to talk about the growth of the economy. But never is there a mention of the equally important, and perhaps far more important, amount of new debt that was required to grow the economy by that much. Now, there is something here which I'd like to discuss later, but in order to grow the economy, new money has to be introduced into the economy. So however much the economy grew, that growth is a reflection of borrowed money, money that was borrowed in order to grow the economy. Every single one of these green squares or rectangles, partial cubes, represent an amount of borrowed money that was used to grow the economy by that much. All right, now let's look at the next decade. Here's 1960 to 1969. Here's the GDP growth for that period. And here is the amount of new debt that was required to grow the economy that much. And here we will see the one and only anomaly in this terrain. And that is right here. This block. I'm going to turn to a right view and look at 1965 here. 1965 is the only year in all of these records where GDP growth was greater than the amount of new debt by that little gray space right there. It still required a lot of new debt to be able to grow the economy that much in 1965. But 1965 sticks out as the only year in which new debt did not exceed GDP growth. All right. Now, you notice that this block right here in 1968 is getting rather tall. I'm going to highlight that block, turn to the right view again. You can see here this strip of red sticking out above the highlighted block. That is the amount of new debt that it took in 1968 to grow the economy by that much. You can see in 1967 new debt was much greater to grow the economy by this much. And in 1969, while a fairly robust year of economic growth, it required even more debt to be taken out in order to grow the economy that much. All right, I have one more, the 1970s, because after that, using this scale becomes a bit unwieldy again because the amounts are too large and it gets hard to see the earlier years. So that's when we go back to this scale. All right, so let's eliminate that. Here's the 1970s. Here are the GDP gains for the 1970s. They are quite respectable. We're getting into some serious growth here. And then here is the new debt that was required in order to make these gains. Whoa! Whoa, look at that. That is huge. I mean, we're talking by 1979 over $1.5 trillion more than the economic growth was required in new debt just to grow that much in the economy. This is something never talked about. Ever. Not ever talked about. This is something that people really don't understand because it's never talked about. Now, economic growth is fine. That's great. It's fantastic. But the thing is, to take out all that new debt in order to grow the economy that much, well, the economy grows by a certain percentage, yes. But all that debt has interest attached to it. You have to pay that back as well as pay the interest on it. And that, my friends, is where inflation really comes from. It's not what we've been told about too much money chasing too few goods. It's that we have a debt-based monetary system. I'll get into that in more detail a little later on. But in the meantime, those graphs are built the wrong direction. They are built with a timeline going across the bottom and a scale going up, so all the figures read going up. All right? In our reality, we have to look at where the debt is, and then we have to place our economic growth or our economy at the bottom of the pit created by all this debt. Now let's look at that from the right side. And you can see fairly clearly here. Let's go all the way to 1952. You can see this colored band of red right here. Purple there, red there, purple there, red there. Yes, the economy is growing. But that band of debt on top of the economics, on top of the GDP, is growing faster. And it keeps growing faster. And even in 1965, all right, we saw the new GDP growth barely exceeded the new debt required. But the total debt is still greater than the GDP, period. So it doesn't matter that 1 year we had an anomaly, because look at what happens as we go through time, and that debt keeps on growing. And I'm going to once again remind you that GDP has to start at the bottom of the pit that debt has dug for us. All right, now I'm going to have to back out a bit. There's a train coming by. It's going to get a little noisy. We're at the 1990s. There's the 2000s. If I move that 2000 up to the top of my screen, we are disappearing off the bottom now. There is 2010. And as we keep going to 2020, we've completely disappeared. Oh, what do we have here? I am not properly aligned with this one. All right, taken and fixed that. All right, so let me wrap this up. We're in a big debt hole. That debt hole is $80 trillion deep, and our GDP is only $31 trillion. All right, this graph shows right here that our economy is not capable of paying down debt of this magnitude. As a matter of fact, our economy has never been capable of paying down the debt, period. And the reason why is very simple. The economy is very much like these blocks. You build it, 1 block, 2 blocks, stack a block on top and stack another block, and it's work and production and materials and more work, and you stack the blocks and it grows organically. The debt, however, because of rules made not by us, has an interest charge attached to it. And that debt, that interest, grows exponentially. That line that we see in reverse here is an exponential growth curve. And that's what compounded interest does. And when you have a situation where growth requires nearly double the amount of new loans just to make it work, you have a no-win situation. You have a crisis. You have a society being crippled on purpose, because compounded interest is not natural. It's a mathematical construct that's been applied to our monetary system and our economy. Okay, in the next episode, we're going to talk about the final structure of the economy. These are the megastructures, and it will bring into clear focus exactly what our problems are.